Clapperboard, you're about to hear an original HFY sci-fi tale titled Officers Declared Rations Gone. Humans built traps, cooked stew, and invited everyone. Find a quiet spot, put on your headphones, and let the stars fall silent. If you enjoy cinematic sci-fi narrations, consider subscribing for more. Now we begin. The first sound was the wind crawling across broken hull plates, a slow metallic breath that dragged the smell of burned composites through the forest. 27 survivors huddled beneath a crescent of shattered wings, faces ash-streaked, eyes following the orange pulse of warning indicators flickering themselves to death. The Skywarden, pride of convoy, lay skewered on an alien meadow like a whale harpooned and rolled to sand. In the blue morning light, the meadow's flowers opened like tiny mouths rimmed with silver teeth and drank the heat rising from the wreck. They had dropped out of FTL into a storm of debris and silent ships, navigational ghosts whispering wrong numbers until the Skywarden's belly ripped and the planet took them. Captain Mara Vale walked through drifting coolant, boots leaving luminous tracks, and listened to her ship dying. The officers gathered, the ones still breathing under a tangle of collapsed conduits. Lieutenant Pax threw a thermal blanket around a private whose hands shook so hard he couldn't zip it. Surgeon Keeper Imani wedged a chest tube into a Marine coughing up pink foam. No one looked to the horizon, they looked to their captain. Say it, Mara told herself before she spoke. She was a tall woman with a miner's shoulders and a voice built for bad news. She had buried a father in the regolith of Ceres and had never learned how to break softly. The crew waited, the coolant fog turning every breath to stained glass ghosts between them. Rations are gone, she said. It was not entirely true. Somewhere in the wreck, a half-crushed crate of nutrient bars waited to be discovered weeks later, but for the moment the truth was the only compass. We have water reclaim for 3 days if we cut to minimal. The transmitter didn't survive. The planet's biosphere is unknown. We can stay here and starve in place, or we can act like the species that made it to the stars. A murmur, not agreement yet, just the sound of humans finding their spines. Wind skittered petals across the fractured deck. At the edge of the meadow, trees with fluted trunks trembled like tuned instruments. Act how? Pax asked. The lieutenant had the look of a man who had fought gravity all his life, the kind of earthborn whose legs carried stories of mountains. He wiped engine soot from his lashes. We're not hunters. We're human, Mara said. Our ancestors drew lines in mud and waited with sharpened sticks. They watched the way shadows moved. They learned the paths of prey and the sleeping places of predators, and then they ate. We build, we adapt. She looked at the yawning meadow and the forest beyond, then at the faces of her people, these refugees from a fleet that had scattered like seeds into dark. We set traps, we cook stew, and until the cosmos remembers we exist, we invite everyone. Invite who? Imani asked, but she already knew, already saw the way Mara's gaze turned toward the tall tree line and the thin shapes drifting there like listening ghosts. Anyone with a stomach, Mara said. They began by choosing ground. The wreckage had cut the meadow like a plow. Coolant pooled in a shallow basin where a girder had carved a channel, and the planet's thin water had already started to fill it. While the engineers sealed leaks that would poison the stream, the Marines fanned out in a 300-meter arc and planted beacons that chirped in soft pulses. The sound carried through the plants in ripples, warning nothing except their own people to the limits of safety. Imani and 2 techs scraped growth off the nearest trees with gloved hands. The bark glittered like ground glass and hid small bright beetles that hummed in triple tones when exposed. They built a bioscreen of scavenged filters, made a column of maybe edible things, and a mountain of touch with sticks only. Everything else became compost piled at the meadow's edge. Some things in the compost pile shifted hours after being dumped there. No one asked why. Pax and a pair of machinists went into the forest with lines made from rewoven harnesses, stakes hammered from the landing gear's bones, and a library of old Earth wisdom downloaded into their headsets. No one knew if it would apply here, but human instinct, Pax decided, was a kind of universal tool. If you watched long enough, the world told you where its seams were. He moved like a fox in a black flight suit and paused near a trail where a film of silver dust had been brushed aside by frequent passage. The footprints were three-pointed, each toe a blade shape. The depth suggested a body mass roughly the same as a deer. He grinned. "We can work with deer." Back at the wreck, Mara oversaw construction of a hearth. The word felt primitive and perfect. A ring of ceramic heat shields, a basin of repurposed coolant-proof stone, a canopy to pull smoke sideways into a slit in the hull where charcoals could hide. The crew had no wood. They had broken ship furnishings. They had crate slats. They had scrubbing filters that, when twisted, burned slow and bright. They had caution. The first fire sputtered in green tongues as impurities burned off, and everyone gasped. Heat on their faces, cheeks shining with the first good light they'd seen since the crash. They cooked nothing that night because there was nothing to cook. They warmed the ache out of their bones and pretended their stomachs were not empty caves. Mara walked the perimeter until dawn, watching shapes at the tree line, slender forms that stepped like herons, pausing, listening, drifting closer each hour until the day made them shy again. On the second day, Pax brought back meat. He came out of the forest sweating and triumphant with 3 teammates hauling a sled of woven straps. On it lay a creature the size of a yearling mule deer, body sleek and black, long ears like blades, eyes covered by a membrane that reflected the world in violet. Where its hooves would have been, it had 3 cleft toes, each tipped with a soft pad that made it silent as a falling leaf. It was beautiful. It was food. The kill had been clean, a drop pit disguised with a lattice of fronds. The animal's slender foreleg had broken. Pax had gone in with a shard of landing strut honed into a spear. He had knelt afterward, hand on its flank, whispering something it wouldn't understand. There was a smell that came from the open body, a mineral sweetness under the iron. Imani set up a sterilized field. They sampled blood, tested for proteins that might sneak past human immunity to do old bad work. The tests came back like small nods, risky but less risky than starving. The crew gathered. Someone cried, someone laughed and couldn't stop. It was Mira, the youngest, a tech with a crown of red hair and oil on her tongue, who asked if they were going to share. At first no one understood. With each other, Pax grinned, already a savage with admiration for their luck. "Yes, Mira, we're not animals." "With them," she said and pointed. The heron shapes watched from the trees, silhouettes cut from blue glass. They were not animals either, they stood too still. Mara kept her face unreadable and her voice level. "We don't know if they eat what we eat." "We don't know," Mira whispered, "if they are hungry." Mara stood a long while at the edge of the meadow, feeling the weight of command. She had given orders in vacuum while the hull screamed. She had watched the light go out of men who would never get a proper grave. But this decision felt heavier. An offering is never only food. It is a statement, it says. We are not here to pillage, it says. We respect that this place has rules. Invite everyone, she had promised. So they did. They cooked stew. They cut the meat in rough squares and dropped it into the pot with water drawn from the cleaned basin through a filter bed layered with cloth and sand. They added shaved bark that tested negative for toxins and smelled faintly of cinnamon. They added starberries crushed with a wrench head, their juice a blue that stained fingers and turned the water a twilight purple. Imani found a root with a knotted orange heart. It stung the tongue and made lips numb. "That's pepper," Mira declared and scraped shavings into the boil. Steam rose, voices softened. The stew took on gravity, pulling people close as if the pot were a small sun. When the meat turned tender, when the vapor smelled like wild rain and memory, Mara filled a shallow lid with a wooden ladle and walked it alone toward the trees. She stopped 10 meters from the line of shadows. The figures there were half seen, only the shifting of light on their skin giving away the muscles under. She lowered slowly and set the lid on a rock, then stepped back until her heels touched meadow plant. She held up open hands, no words. A long time passed as the steam curled from the gift and the forest breathed. A figure emerged, smaller than the others, shoulders furrowed like carved stone. It had no mouth that Mara could see, only folded ridges along its lower face that fluttered delicately in the stew's vapor. Its eyes were dark as caves. It crouched. It extended a narrow, many-jointed hand tipped with hookless nails. It touched the lid rim, then lifted the offering with surprising ease and retreated. When it vanished into the trees, the line of shadows shifted, ripple through ripple, until silence was again a woven thing. Mara exhaled and found that she had been holding herself as if in a vacuum suit, waiting for impact. "Now we wait," she said to no one and everyone. They didn't wait long. By evening, the forest returned the lid. It slid out onto the meadow grass on a cushion of air. It was clean. It held a handful of pale bulbs like peeled hearts. Mira, brave and foolish, cracked one with a knife and inhaled. "Onion," she said simply, voice breaking. They brought us onions. No one slept much that night because the stew had awakened something inside them older than language. It was not just that they had eaten. It was that they had been allowed to share. The hearth smoldered. The last ladlefuls sat in cups between hands held like prayer. At dawn, the first trap was sprung by something else. It wasn't Pax's dear creature this time. The line snapped with the force of a winch, and a shape slammed into the spring branch hard enough to shake a sheet of frost from its leaves. The creature thrashed, a rope of muscle and anger, four-legged with a heavy triangular head, teeth sawed like broken glass. Marines moved in, calm and quick, spears held at angles. Pax cursed softly, admiring despite himself. A predator. The thing's eyes were a lidless gold. Its hide was scaleless, armored in overlapping plates that flexed like a warrior's back. They could have killed it, and hungry men do not waste meat. But there was a feeling here, a question hanging in the air like a hawk. Mara stepped forward and ran her hand along the line binding its leg. The creature's breath was hot and stank of something like ammonia crossed with lightning. She met its gaze long enough to feel the edges of its animal mind. It was strong. It would learn them if they let it. It would follow one day at the edge of camp like the first wolves had on the tundra. "Cut it loose," she said. Pax stared. "Captain, that's a mistake with teeth." "We're not indiscriminate," Mara replied. "We are precise." They released the predator and watched it melt into the trees, bruised dignity in each step. Maybe it would stalk them tomorrow. Maybe it would teach their enemies to fear the smell of their cooking. Maybe, like wolves, it would become a partner fashioned by hunger and offered scraps. The future was a flare in fog. No one could see the path until their feet found it. Days braided into a sequence of work. Traps placed, baited, studied, improving the design as the forest taught them what it accepted and what it spat back. A sap with a sweet, bitter, bruised peach smell cooled fever when spread on the tongue. Too much shut the lungs. A plant that looked like celery shattered into bone-dry splinters at a touch. A trick of humidity that could be shaped. Pax wove its brittle stalks into caltrops that collapsed under a heavy foot to produce an explosion of needles. A perimeter made of plant works, not mines. They sanded the ship's fractured edges and used the filings to dust trap lines. The filings glittered to mark every path in the moonlight, a language of quiet warnings written across the earth. The forest watched them and learned. The second invitation came from the other side. On the sixth day, the sky boiled with sound as something like a manta ray the size of a hall uncoiled from the clouds. It was not an animal. It was a war machine, beating metallic wings to push air and season the land with terror. It followed the smoke rising from the human's hearth and hung above the meadow, its belly open in a hatch that glinted blue like frozen fire. Shadows wearing segmented armor slid down from it on lines that snicked with each casual descent. They were tall, joints backward bent, heads encased in crested helmets that turned the morning into a battlefield. Pax swore and raised a spear he had fashioned with love and welded metal. Marines fell into positions that their bodies remembered even if this planet did not. The officers formed a line, human shapes stitched together by stubbornness and training, and the simple fact of their species. Mara stepped forward from that line because she understood pageantry and the power of walking into the teeth of a threat with your spine straight. She held in her hand a wooden ladle. It was Mira's idea, but Mara owned it now. She raised the ladle and set it down slowly on the grass between them and the descending soldiers. The armored figures halted, a murmur through their ranks, their helmets turning to track the object as if it were a weapon. "Unarmed," Mara said softly. "The word doesn't always translate, but tone often does. Eat with us, or cut us down, choose quickly." A soldier's foot touched the ladle with the toe of a boot carved from something like obsidian. The soldier looked up at the captain, whose face was the face of a woman who would not yield and who would not move first. The soldier's hand rose to his helmet and unlatched the seals. The helmet parted with a sigh. Inside was a face like pumice stone with eyes set far apart and lips mapped in ridges. It resembled the small figure from the forest. It was, in some important way, kin. The soldier handed the ladle back without looking down. He did not kneel. He did not lower his weapon, but his wings of armor creaked in something like respect. He spoke in a language that clicked and washed. Behind him, his manta machine hummed a note that vibrated the teeth. Mara understood nothing of the words. She did, however, understand hunger and rusted engines, and the way a soldier's posture changes when he sees home cooking after months of paste. She did what grandmothers on Earth had done in kitchens carved into mountains and under cities after blackouts. She turned her back, danger itself, and walked to the pot. All at once the meadow seemed very quiet. She lifted the lid and let the steam rise. Starberries turned the air into a dawn. Onion hearts softened. Garlic notes from another gift pierced the bark cinnamon and the pepperroot heat. She filled a shallow bowl and carried it back. The armed figure took the bowl and raised it to the ridged lips. He tasted. He stood very still, not the stillness of fear or attack, but of something that has been surprised into changing shape. He took another sip. He made a small sound like a pebble dropped into a deep well. He turned and said something over his shoulder. The manta lowered until its shadow wrapped the humans in blue. Dozens more soldiers descended with a whisper of lines. Weapons remained ready but not pointed. They formed not a wall but the suggestion of one. And then something impossible happened. A column of figures entered the meadow from the trees. Their skin was not armored. Their feet were bare like brushed stone. They were elders and children and all in between. The soldiers parted to let them pass, and the first of the civilians stepped forward with cupped hands that offered pale bulbs, roots, herbs, more of the onion hearts and curling sticks that looked like cinnamon and tasted exotic and perfect. They laid these gifts between the survivors and the soldiers, and then they stepped away and looked at Mara like someone waiting to see if the rain would fall. So human hands reached out and took alien onions. Alien fingers lifted bowls poured by human ladles. Weapons faced the earth. A hush that was bigger than quiet fell over the meadow. They ate together. Later, much later, the elders would look at the human's hearth and call it by a word that meant, roughly, the place where enemies remember they are animals that warm themselves. But that first shared meal had no name until it was over. It was simply a choice not to die as strangers. The stew burned tongues across species. It filled ribs and sat there like a promise. The soldier's commander approached, flanked by two with spiked pauldrons that meant something. The commander lifted a hand. In it rested a token, a thin plate etched with a map. He pressed it into Mara's palm and closed her fingers around it. The plate felt like a worn coin. On it, lines like river veins webbed an oval shape their world. In the lines, certain places glowed faintly. The plate hummed. It held coordinates burned with a subtle current. He spoke again, softer this time, more consonants, less ritual. Imani stepped forward, voice gentle, and pointed to herself, and then to the commander, then to the stew and to the ship, a cradling gesture. We share, we mend. She touched the plate. We go here. The commander nodded. He pointed at the ship and then to the sky where distant streaks glowed in the early afternoon, streaks of something burning in from orbit. He pressed his thumb to the plate, a new point lit closer on the other side of the ridge. He tapped his chest. War, he said, the first human word to leave his mouth like a gift. War comes. Pax's jaw set. Whose war? The commander's head tilted. He looked up where the streaks grew brighter and his face became something like stone warmed by the first light of day. He said a word that sounded like a blade drawn from a sheath, the name of an empire that no human throat could shape without bleeding. The shared meal ended because meals end. Dishes return to pot, pot returns to fire, fire to ember. Humans cleaned with care, aliens repositioned lines, and spread to the tree line in sentry nests that made Pax jealous. War is the ending of many things and the beginning of more. The first attack struck at dusk when the sky was a bruise with a lit edge. Mara knew it was coming not because the commander barked orders in his layered tongue, but because the forest went so quiet the tiny beetle's triple song could be heard inside the heart's chambers. The air smelled like cold iron and rain that would not fall. The enemy fell out of the sky like glittering ash. Their vehicles were beetle black and ovoid, held aloft by thrumming fields that stirred up grass like the breath of whales. They looked too smooth to be dangerous until their undersides opened like mouths and the world became light. Beams scythed the meadow. Where they touched, soil glassed, flowers became steam in pretty curling swans that lasted just the shape of a blink before they vanished. The humans were not ready for that kind of precision, but they had not survived the fall to die without expression. The first beam carved the hearth into an oval mirror and tossed the pot into the air. Pax screamed a wordless roar and hurled his spear at the nearest ovoid with a throw that would have broken a plate at a county fair. The spear struck the hull and clanged off uselessly. He reached for another. You never run out of throws until you do. The Allied soldiers, the ones who had eaten, moved like water up the meadow's slope, and where they went their curved guns sang long notes that didn't sound like weapons. Their shots were slender lances of pale force that bent mid-flight to follow targets. Ovoids spidered with cracks and fell like insects with broken wings. The soldiers fired from behind humans as if that had been the plan all along. The galaxy's war stepped into the clearing, and the first taste of it was metal in the mouth and the memory of stew steam. Mara did not run. She moved along the line of the wounded as Imani triaged, as Marines turned tables into shields, as Mira lifted a shattered heat shield like a banner. The captain's hands shook for the first time since the crash, not with fear but with a deep anger that felt older than any war. They were not invaders. They were crash-fallen. They had made a meal and invited the planet. Someone had come to break that. She picked up a pot lid and used it to reflect the glare from a beam just enough to blind an approaching soldier, long enough for Pax to drive a metal stake down and pull a trip line across the small dip of shattered ground. One of the enemy infantry charged, feet clanging on the ship's ribs, and his boot hit that human-shaped mistake in the earth. He went down. Pax finished what he started with the careful economy of a butcher. Traps, Mara said hoarsely into her calm beads. Fall back to the trap line. They had not planned for another species war, but nature loves patterns and humans love to learn them. The trap line was a serpentine path of pits and snares and caltrop collapses built from brittle celery plants. They had arranged it to catch deer creatures on their way to water. Enemy infantry moved like deer when they were excited, eyes forward, shoulders forward, weapons up, unaware of feet. They fell like deer. Mara lit a handful of starberries and hurled them into a pit. Their flaring juices made the walls slick, and armored figures slid back into a knife garden of ship shards. On the ridge, allied soldiers sang ruin into the night, their weapons bending light, curling it, singing it. The enemy vehicles, offended by gravity, lurched and came too low. Pax's handmade spears, mostly laughable against hull plating, found exposed intake vents and cracked them open like egg shells. The first ovoid broke against a tree in fireworks. A cheer went up because human throats needed it. The battle moved as battles do, forward, back, like a tide with knives. The hearth was gone. The stew lay in a glistening lake that steamed into the air as a last gift of scent. Imani's hands were red and busy. She stapled a marine's chest under the shadow of an alien soldier who bled pale. "We bleed the same," she muttered, not as philosophy but as fact, and tied off a vein with a strip of her own sleeve. At the height, Mara found herself standing on the ship's highest surviving rib, the wind smearing ash across her cheeks. The enemy commander landed on the rib opposite, slim and tall in reflective plating, face a mirror that showed Mara her own face watching her die. He raised a blade of light. She had no blade. She had a ladle and a stake and a heart that had decided she would not bend. She lifted the ladle in one hand, the stake in the other, and watched his blade spit and march toward her like a comet on a leash. Sometimes, in the pressing of the universe, comedy and grace share a border. The predator they had released chose that moment to come out of the forest, drawn by the smell of burning and the music of pain. It leapt, a rope of muscle, at the reflective commander's back with a cry that split the meadow into before and after. The commander spun, too late. The blade swung wide. Mara stepped in and drove the stake into the gap under the arm, feeling it slide with a wet singing through what passed for cartilage there. The commander crumpled silently. The predator pinned the body and growled, gold eyes rolling to fix on Mara. She stepped back, every instinct on ice, and then she nodded as a dog whisperer might to a half-wild creature that has offered a kind of treaty. She reached to her hip pouch and drew out a piece of meat saved from an earlier kill for a moment that had no name until this one. She tossed it. The predator ate and leapt away, dignity restored. When it ended, the meadow looked like a dream someone had torn down with its own hands. The enemy's dead glinted like beetle backs punctured by a hailstorm. The Allied soldiers gathered with a kind of solemn brightness, making piles of their dead and singing a thin, high song that had the shape of wind through reeds. Humans sat wherever they had remained unbroken and trembled and breathed and discovered that they were alive to the next aches. Mara walked among them. She laid her hand on heads, shoulders, weapons. She found Pax kneeling beside a pit, staring at his hands. He had killed with them and saved with them. He had learned a species gait and turned it into a net. He looked at his captain as if asking permission to feel what he felt. "You did well," she said, knowing that praise is medicine you never let run out. He nodded, eyes red without tears. It wasn't just our war, but it became ours the second they fired on a dinner. Mira found the pot. Miraculously, the pot had not split. It had taken flight and landed on a bed of thick moss beyond the worst of the beams. She carried it like an infant, laughing and crying both. The pot was scarred now, its handles bent as if a giant had pinched it. She set it at the hearth's former place and sank down beside it. "Again," she whispered. "Again," Mara said, "tonight." That night they cooked a stew made from the dear creature, the onion hearts, the bark cinnamon, the pepper root, and the smallest slice of shared victory. They fed the Allied soldiers first because it was right. And then while the smoke rose, a column of new figures walked into the meadow from the opposite side. They carried banners on polished poles. Their armor was ornate. Their faces were hidden behind drones that projected beautiful humanish masks that smiled with geometrically perfect mouths and eyes too wide. They came not as crashing invaders, but as the state that had sent the earlier swarm, a bureaucracy dressed as silk. They stood at the edge of firelight and performed a choreographed bow. Mara's chest tightened. The worst kind of enemy is the one that wants to do paperwork after it kills your hearth. She lifted her chin and stepped gently so that the stew's steam could wrap her like a cloak. The leader projected a voice in slow, careful standard, as if reading a script. Unauthorized settlers. You have violated hunting rights on Sovereign Reserve 14. Mara smiled without warmth. We crash-landed. We asked permission of nothing but survival. You have consorted with local illegal elements. The projection voice was so polite it might have been asking for a glass of water. Behind the masks, figures adjusted their grips on ceremonial pikes that were not ceremonial at all. The Allied commander stepped forward and stood shoulder to shoulder with Mara. He pointed at the hearth's ghost and at the stew and at his soldiers. He spoke a paragraph that sounded like storm runoff. The leader listened, nodded, made a note. He looked at Mara again. We are prepared to negotiate fines for this misunderstanding. Mara laughed. It was not the laugh of a woman who had found something funny. It was the sound of a pressure valve releasing before the pipe split. You burned our kitchen. You bled our wounded. You fired on a meal. She stepped closer so that the projection had to recalibrate and the smiling face flickered. You may take your fines and feed them to the river. The leader's drones paused subdividing data on unknown idioms. A soldier behind him shifted, pike blurring. The Allied commander hissed through ridged lips. Marines rose behind Mara like a tide. Pax reached down, picked up a ladle and spun it in his fingers like a baton. For a moment, an entirely new war wanted to be born. Mira saved them again with some childlike courage that belonged to the species more than to her. She dipped the ladle in the stew and held the bowl out. Eat, she said. Then decide if you want to fight a kitchen. The projection looked amused, which was an emotion chosen by a program to humanize a moment. Then the leader reached forward, a small, deliberate surrender of posture, and took the bowl. He held it inside the projection field, and for a second the image of his perfect lips sipping the stew overlapped with the mask, uncanny and wrong. Then he tasted, and a glitch went through the sound system, a small O that was all throat, not program. The masks around him flickered, and behind them shoulders loosened. A soldier sighed. Another whispered something like the syllable for mother. They had not eaten food cooked by hands in too long. They lived off paste and ration cubes served through sterile ports in walls. The leader lifted the bowl and held it between them like a lantern. We will requisition a different understanding. He gestured sharply, and the banners lowered. The pikes dipped in a choreographed reverse that did not quite equal apology but might become one. You will remain under observation. You will harvest within quotas set by mutual consultation. He struggled with the weight of that phrase. You will teach us how to make this stew. Mara, whose father taught her that victory is sometimes not having to fight again tomorrow, smiled with her eyes tired. We agree. You bring onions. They began a peculiar season then with 3 forces arranged like teeth around the hearth. The Allied soldiers, forest-born, ridge-shouldered, fierce, taught humans to read the land. The bureaucratic invaders, silk-armored, drone-faced, brought supplies, sometimes grudging, sometimes generous when the stew especially pleased them. The predator lingered like a rumor at the edges, eating scraps, driving off other beasts that would have been more dangerous. Above, the manta machines hummed like whales. Beneath, the water ran clear. Humans built more traps, but not all for meat. They produced devices that snared information. Radios cobbled from Navcom corpses, antennae strung between trees like harp strings. Pax found a band that sang with messages from other survivors scattered across the planet, voices thin with distance. A woman in a canyon with 5 wounded. A group in the far desert building shelters from the skeletons of ancient towers. A pair of officers hiding in a thorn maze with twisted ankles and a signal mirror. Mara decided to invite them all. They made stew and sent it scent down the wind and wrapped metal pillars in cloth to act as windsocks, so that anyone wandering could follow the line of smell to safety. They set traps along the approach, traps that fired flares to announce the arrival of friends, and different ones that shook the earth, and sent a note through the nettle harp when someone came with armor shining and no appetite. The Allied soldiers began to sing arrival songs that meant, loosely, the guest comes with open hands. People found them. A boy no older than 13 Crow walked out of the forest with his grandmother's ring on a cord and a cut leg that needed 6 stitches. A pair of pilots from a sister ship crawled through the tall grass on their elbows to avoid the ovoids that combed the sky for movement. They laughed until they cried at the sight of steam rising from the pot. A quiet man came one dusk carrying an entire morning in the set of his shoulders, and when he lifted a spoon to his mouth, a fragment of that morning softened and reassembled into a future. They joined, and each new hand made the camp not just larger but more precise. By the second month there were 60 of them. By the fourth, more than 100. They traded. Stories for maps, recipes for safe path metrics, engineered seed for alien route. A woman from the desert group taught them to grind a flour from the thin grasses that grew where fire had been. It baked into flatbread that blistered in minutes on the hot stones, and tasted like schools that had closed when the fleet evacuated Earth. But their bannocks still lived in hands. A Ridge soldier's grandmother came to camp and sat at the edge of the hearth every night with a spoon carved from bone and a quiet smile. She taught humans a method of slicing root that turned it into ribbons. The ribbons absorbed stew in a way that made chewing a kind of worship. Around the 6th month, the enemy changed tactics because war is a long conversation with many speakers. They stopped striking in dazzling droves and began to come as whispers. Poison darts in the water. Hull-slicing mines buried in river shallows. A singing drone that floated over the camp at night and projected images of Earth burning. Wrong images crafted from compiled data and guess pane. Propaganda designed to pry open the seams. Humans are susceptible to images. They carry them forever. But they are also stubborn and they have kitchens. When the drone hovered, projecting a city they had never known catch fire in a physics that did not exist, Mara reached up with a ladle, caught the drone's underside with a clong that made the trees giggle, and brought it down into the stew. The drone thrashed and hissed, and when she pulled it out, it was a mess of softened plastic and boiled lies. She set it aside to cool. Pax took it apart and built from its core a small lantern that glowed with a friendly blue in the night. "A gift," Pax said, handing the blue lamp to the alien commander. The commander cradled it with the care given to relics and babies. It lit his ridges in soft halos. After the river mines, they set a line of nets woven from the brittle celery stalks. The mines stuck to the nets and dissolved like sulking candy. Mara turned the residue into a glaze that hardened into a ceramic tough as ship armor when painted on shields. Imani used the same glaze to make mugs that kept heat for hours. People smiled into those mugs in the cool night and believed that the universe could be bent toward kindness if you kept hammering. The bureaucracy watched with increasing discomfort. Their work depended on a ledger of favors they could grant to keep a people in line. The stew, the nets, the traps, the lanterns. These were favors the humans granted themselves and then offered to others. The bureaucracy responded with what it knew. A blockade around the valley enforced by ovoids and ground patrols that scanned for contraband stew components. A phrase that made even the rigid soldiers laugh when the bureaucrats were not near. The blockade created hunger outside the valley. A wave of refugees arrived, alien faces drawn tight over high bones, human cheeks hollow. The bureaucracy tried to turn them back, but you cannot turn back a tide without becoming a rock that drowns under it. The refugees slipped along deer trails marked by glittering filings and songs sung through nettle harps. They found the smell. They found the hearth. Mara stood on the ship rib and found that command had become something else in these months. It wasn't orders and counters anymore. It was keeping a fire lit and deciding how much to scoop into each bowl. It was ration lines that looked like dance lines. It was an invitation extended again and again until the hand offering it shook. They built a kitchen large enough to feed hundreds. The hearth grew a second mouth, then a third. Engineers used hull segments to form chimneys that rose like silver trees, pulling smoke skyward in neat columns that spelled messages to anyone who knew how to read. Here, here still, here together. On the day the bureaucracy tried to end them, the valley breathed a storm. The ovoids came low and silent. The net line shivered as a dozen at once hit and melted their way through. On the ridge, new machines parked with their rear ends facing the valley, siege engines shaped like the tails of scorpions. They launched spines that unfurled midair into nets of light that dropped and wrapped and cinched. One landed over the kitchen, shrinking. Fire flared. A cook cried out as the net bit into his skin with electric teeth. Overhead, the manta machines of the Allied soldiers rolled in, but their numbers were too small. The bureaucracy had chosen a day with the commanders away chasing another fight. It was a day designed for slaughter. Mara ran beneath a collapsing net with a knife in each hand. She had learned knots from a woman who tied down ships for storms in the belt. She cut where the lines met. She cut and burned her palms. The net squealed and loosened, then cinched again, a living thing with hate. Pax hurled a bucket of stew into a light net, and wherever the broth splattered, the lattice sparked and released with childish surprise. Mira whooped and splashed more, turning supper into solvent. People grabbed ladles and mugs and scooped and threw. The air sizzled with garlic and resistance. On the ridge, the Allied soldiers fought in tight fans, bending shots around siege engines. They were precise and brave and dying. The bureaucracy's drones projected polite notices apologizing for the inconvenience of the current civic action. From the trees, a figure strode out wrapped in a netting of old maps. He had a beard grown wild and eyes like stones at dawn. He carried a makeshift flag built from a ship's SOS banner tied to a rib of the skywarden. Around him walked 20 men and women whose faces rode the edge between salvation and madness. The beard man's voice boomed without amplifier. "You are cordially invited," he declared, "to dinner." He was one of the stranded, a captain of the ship that had